Hey everyone, today we're ranking every killer in the game based on their weakest state within DbD history, so we're taking the lowest point of every character basically and judging them in a tier list. All killers at their weakest state ranked worst to best. Here's our tiers, and let's get into it. F. Failure in every way. This tier is for the really awful killers who were so bad they barely worked or barely even had a power. Freddy, I think, takes the cake for the worst killer in the game's entire history, with his release date being genuinely awful. He basically didn't have a power, and not only that, but his power was debatably a direct nerf to him as it stood in the way of him applying basic damage. Original Freddy was not able to damage survivors who weren't in the dream world. The only way to get them in was by manually pulling them in by getting close to them. Once he did this, he could then apply damage, but he also got slowed down to give the survivors a chance to run, and he had no additional tools back then to counter them. No dream pallets, no snares, no teleport. The only benefit he had was that he was invisible to those who were awake, making him able to get close without being seen. There were a few other elements to him, but they're honestly not even worth mentioning and do very little to redeem him. He was awful. Wraith was another killer who really suffered in the early days and was by far the weakest of the original three on launch, with him having so many problems and easy counters. One of the key downsides of early Wraith was how restrictive his cloak was. Back then, when cloaked, he couldn't open lockers or break pallets even, making him very hard to play and just really awkward. He further had slower cloaking speeds, louder noises, and his bell could be heard throughout the map. Despite him being the game's stealth character, early on, he did not fit this role at all. Skull Merchant, and her current soft kill switch state, is the worst she's ever been in power-wise. It was an intentional move by the devs seemingly too, with her being hated since her release. She's currently in a waiting line for a rework. In the meantime, she's been given a plethora of nerfs, the worst one being that her drones only have one scan line. This makes it very difficult to accumulate stacks and play her at all really. She's maybe the closest since original Freddy to literally not having a power. Singularity may surprise you to see so low, but he was one of the worst killers we've ever gotten in his early days, and particularly his PTB. During the PTB, he was pretty much unusable, despite him basically having the same power. The key difference was EMPs. They were extremely busted. They would spawn already charged and were readily available throughout the map. You couldn't set up your biopods because they'd instantly get destroyed by someone. He was miserable, and it was the hardest PTB I've ever played as killer. Ghostface is another who was awful on his PTB, and it was for the one reason of his reveal mechanic being absolutely dreadful. There was a joke even at the time that you could simply spin around in a circle as a survivor and reveal him. As long as your vision dragged across his general area for a split second, he was revealed. It was insanely sensitive, and essentially left him powerless for the duration of a trial. It's still a little sensitive and weird nowadays, but nowhere near as bad as back then. E for extremely bad. This is for the killers who were really awful but maybe not quite as unplayable or lacking in ability as the bottom tier. Trapper is a weird case where his strongest and weakest is debatably the same point, depending on perspective. It was during the early days. But there was a specific point in these early days where lots of the OP things that he got early on were actually nerfed, and this was around February 2017. Trapper had much slower trap speed, perks that directly countered his power, such as Slippery Meat and Saboteur, which could permanently break his traps, and by this point in time, all the OP stuff that he had working for him had been removed, such as placing traps directly under hooks. So he still had a lot of negative stuff at this early point, but most of the OP stuff was gone, leaving him overall very weak. A sort of bad balance to have. Twins, December 2020 / their PTB was their very worst state. During this PTB and the early days, they were one of the most buggy killers the game has ever seen. Probably the most buggy, I would still say. A notable one I remember is Victor getting stuck in the trial floor, unable to move or escape. It wasn't just the bugs though, there were also huge oversights in their power, really big issues like the fact that if you climbed into a locker as Survivor and Victor was being controlled, he couldn't do anything. Lockers just completely countered the power, unlike now where Victor can trap survivors in until Charlotte returns. The main issue with their gameplay was that Victor could be held hostage too. Once he attached onto a survivor, the team could simply keep him. Having one player take him, Charlotte would never get him back as there was no mechanic for this. Victor would stay until the survivor chose to take him off, or they were downed. It was pretty miserable. Hag is a killer who upon release was really dreadful and had a ton of downsides. The key one being just how awfully slow she was. Trap set speed was far slower. It looks quite comical to see it nowadays actually. She had a weird jitter every time she teleported. Many of her add-ons had downsides. It's a bizarre case. If you look at her early days add-ons, there's a ton that just have a negative side effect for some reason. Just a bunch of them that aren't even that strong, but they have a downside. It's really odd. Her teleport range was also a whole 16 meters less than it is now, and she had a bunch of silly quality of life issues like her traps being triggerable in the dying state. Really weird. Sadako had a pretty rough launch too, where her condemned mechanic was not oppressive enough, which is sort of opposite to how it is now. This was March 2022, and it was mostly down to her condemned just not really doing that much. It was easily countered and quite counterintuitive, with it only applying if survivors were next to active TVs. It was easy to turn off TVs too, and they stayed off for 100 seconds, almost 2 whole minutes, and survivors could return tapes quickly, with there being no set TV to return it to, leading many to always run the old iridescent videotape. She could also be stunned whilst demanifested, which is fun. Trickster was incredibly bad around his release in March 2021, which wasn't too different to how he is now honestly, only he still had lots of other downsides back then, such as not having laser accurate knives, his blade required 8 lacerations to damage, yup, 8. His main event took forever to charge and could only be used during a very short window, meaning you simply didn't get to use it most of the time. Even if you did, it wasn't very effective. He was also slower with a movement speed of just 4.4, his add-ons were generally pretty terrible too. He had a lot of problems which were slowly buffed up over time. D for dreadful. These killers were still really bad, but maybe not quite as bad as a lot of the lower ones. Still pretty usable, but, well, dreadful still. Doctor was worst in his original iteration back in May 2017. If you didn't know, he's had 2 big reworks, with his original state being the really awful one. Back then he was a little weirder. He had sort of an AoE shock field around him, and in order to use your shock attack you had to switch to a different stance where you were no longer able to damage, but you were able to shock. It was really bizarre. He also didn't get the big shock blast, making it harder to find people. Madness was generally less effective too, and the power required a lot of buffs to get it into a good spot. So yeah, Doctor back then was pretty rough. Bubba's release date in September 2017 was quite a sad one, with him having the most bare bones power ever. The poor man simply had a chainsaw. Not only that, but it had a really awkward activation. Unlike Billy's, which is a tap to activate, Bubba's worked by fully charging a bar and then releasing. Back then he also had no charges, so you couldn't extend the sweep, and his add-ons were all copy and pasted over from Billy. This meant Bubba had a bunch of ill-fitting add-ons that made no sense for him at all. Insanely bare bones release and really quite weak. Still had insta-down potential though, I suppose. Myers I sort of bounced around on, because part of me feels like his post-nerf early days could be his weakest, but that may just be his current. I mean, he's really bottom tier nowadays. Most of his busted add-ons have been adjusted or nerfed down, and he really struggles due to being sort of out of date from the times. So I just want to say now, I think. Knight could be debated to be his weakest during his 2025 PTB, where the guard banners spawned very quickly. However, I think he was weaker than this at other points. For example, his launch in November 2022. The guards back then were far worse, I think. You couldn't pick between them, and they all shared the same cooldown. Further, they were simply worse, taking longer to spawn, and in other ways like causing less damage to generators. Knight's orb and trail when placing his guards was also completely visible, making it really easy to see where a guard would be. So I would say this was a bit weaker still. Blight was worst in September 2020, or his PTB. Blight was actually quite bad on release, I would say. Partially because his potential hadn't been seen quite yet, but also because he had a lot of flaws. One of the main ones was the bugginess of him, and his awful collision. His original state, he must have had some of the worst collision in the game, honestly. He felt really terrible to play, with him struggling to even do things on certain maps like get up the stairs, from the best of my memory at least. Where now there's a real clean precision. This simply didn't exist back then. He was also really short for some reason. His POV was about half the size, which made it a lot harder to to mind game and play him well. I still don't really know why that was happening. Pig, despite being the common joke of killers being nerfed a lot and killers being weak, I don't think has had it as bad as a lot of other killers, in terms of their very worst state at least. She's had more of a consistently bad string of nerfs compared to a particularly awful state, I would say. I would go with September 2019 though as her worst, with this being close to her release and post a number of nerfs that seemed really unfair. Her terror radius went from 28 meters to 32, her traps only activated on generator completion, where before they would also activate during the endgame and activate to kill if someone left out of the gates, inactive or not. Her ambush further got nerfed to not count as a basic attack, which I suppose is fair. It just seemed really rough though alongside all of these other changes. A bunch of add-ons got dunked on too. C for Can't Catch a Break. This is for a tier of killers who had notably rough states, but ones that were inconvenient over being truly awful. Dredge was weakest during May 2022, its PTB. The main downside Dredge had, as it wasn't all too different compared to now, was the Nightfall. It wasn't really Nightfall, it was more Lightfall. Nightfall was very ineffective and honestly just quite bright during the PTB. It didn't really do that great a job at cloaking the area, and so Dredge was nowhere near as stealthy, and Nightfall was far less effective. This was remedied for life though, and it's not changed much since then. Clown has basically only been buffed, so I would say around his release in June 2018 was his weakest. Back then he lacked a lot of things, such as his yellow bottles, but also certain quality of life improvements like his current faster bottle reload and bottle number being higher. He did have some slightly more busted add-ons back then, such as Redhead's Pinky Finger, not adjusting his bottle number, but post these nerfs and close to his original state was his weakest, I'd say. Still not too bad though. Spirit was actually kind of weak on release, not super weak, but definitely much weaker in September 2018. She quickly became very powerful though, especially as people learned her. Her power recovery back then was a little longer at 20 seconds. The big kicker though was how her phasing worked and sounded. It was much easier before to locate her and avoid her. If you were close to the husk, you could hear her phasing directionally, allowing you to pinpoint where she was. Spirit's breathing was also very audible, making it quite easy to track her. Collision was also a thing during her phase, with this sort of benefiting both sides at different points, but also working against Spirit a lot. Overall, I'd say this was her weakest state, especially considering the insane state she's been in. This was decently weak. Houndmaster was worst at her release in November of 2024. Her main problem was just bugs, honestly. She really struggled because of all the bugs she had going on, particularly with Snug getting stuck on various objects or in animations. There were definitely some weaknesses of her power at base 2 though, but this was swiftly addressed in 2 follow-up patches where she received nice big buff walls. Chucky was weakest for a shortish period after his 2024 nerfs to his dash, where he became far slower when dashing and had to charge it up over time. This along with his scamper being nerfed and some of his best add-ons, which left him in a pretty rough state, but not awful, just a lot worse than before. Xenomorph I'd have to go with its 2025 PTB. It was weakest here largely because of the turret rework, and the fact that Xeno could be burned out of its power incredibly easily, and leaving you without a power for a lot of the match. This got a real uproar from the community, worried that Xeno would be skull merchanted, and so it got reversed. Legion's worst state was also debatably their strongest, depending on how you view it. It was also the point in time where they could make people DC, as if you simply played normally against them, they were actually fairly beatable, as it took quite a while to wait out a bleed timer still. However, the slightly worse point was post their nerf for this state, which was in May 2019, where they received a huge wall of nerfs along with a number of bad add-on changes, basically dumpstering them. B for BAverage. This is a tier for killers who, whilst quite nerfed, were still fairly average despite this. Billy's worst state unsurprisingly was in July 2020, when he was going through his huge overheat rework and just being toyed around with a lot. Whilst he was still okay during this time, it was the inconsistency and constant changes that really messed with him. He went from being a smooth playing top tier killer to an average clunky one, receiving the overheat mechanic which essentially stopped you from using your power too much. The more you used the chainsaw, the more it overheated and eventually stopped working. He also got a ton of ridiculously bad add-on changes. Take the old Mother's Helpers for example, which recovered overheat faster if a flashlight was shining on you. Like, What? Plague had her weaker state at launch in March 2019. Plague's main difference was that she didn't spawn with a corrupted pool to start. This meant sometimes she was a little harder as survivors would never cleanse, and so you'd never get the red vomit, with the red vomit also lasting a shorter time too. Even that though, I'd argue wasn't that bad, but definitely worse. The big kicker was that infection used to reset whenever a survivor was hooked, and infection generally lasted a shorter time on objects, so that was pretty bad. Demogorgon to me is the epitome of BAverage. Demo has been consistently mid for its entire existence basically. It was only very slightly weaker I would say on launch in the PTB, where it wasn't able to shred pallets. Yeah, that was a thing at one point, so very early days it was slightly weaker. Springtrap I'd also put in BAverage. His weakest state is just his current one I guess. His PTB state was a bit stronger, and his current state is really average I would say. He's a very mid-tier killer in my opinion. Vecna I would say was his release state as his weakest, and largely because his spells just took longer generally speaking. Longer cooldowns, slightly weaker effects, and overall less cohesion. Still pretty damn good though, at least compared to a lot of others. Nemesis would be June 2021, his release. He hadn't been buffed yet, and so he was slightly weaker compared to now. Nemi's basically always been about the same though, so yeah, just the slight difference of his early days compared to now was a bit weaker. Slower move speed with the tentacle, worse infection progression, worse add-ons, that kind of thing. Small stuff. A for amazing. Even at their weakest, these killers were still amazing. Unknown's worst state is very slightly its launch state by the tiniest margin, due to its only patch being a slight buff. Unknown is just very strong plainly, and so still is even at its weakest. Deathslinger is another one of those killers who, whilst he does have weaker states, they're not that different from his current version. Sure, his insta ADS self was way better, but he's still really solid, taking him from OP to really good. His weakest I suppose though would be post his ADS nerfs and before his string of buffs, so somewhere during that time. Artist has been very rarely changed at all, with her being strong throughout the years, although slightly less than her PTB. Her worst version was probably a 2025 PTB version, where she got a bunch of add-on nerfs and was also very buggy at the time. Pinhead I would say just his current version, along with some others here. He's never really been bad, just had worse states, and he was generally stronger upon his release with some better add-ons and slightly stronger mechanics, so I'd just say now. Wesker I'd go with around his release or possibly PTB in August 2022. Whilst he did have a lot of benefits back then that he doesn't have now, such as his faster Ouroboros progression and retaining more infection post-hook, his bounds were far worse back then and the collision was quite poor. This was mainly why he was weaker I'd say, is just for the fact that you could bound through someone sometimes and it just wouldn't connect for whatever reason. So whilst he was highly played, he was also seen as quite frustrating. Even with this in mind though, I'd still say he was really good, at least comparatively to other weak states. Oni is another one quite hard to pinpoint because he's never really been bad or weak even debatably, and his patch notes are barely even there. He's had like 2 changes. His PTB state was one of his strongest, and only recently he's been buffed up a lot. I'd maybe argue it was just post his release and the PTB, where he had received a lot of nerfs from the PTB, and had a turn rate limit with his dashing. That was kind of bad I suppose. This is the best I can think of though honestly, he's never been bad really. S, still somehow incredible. Our tier for the killers who, against all odds, are still insanely good, even at their weakest state throughout DbD history. Huntress has been through a variety of states, but she's always been really good, relative to the rest on this list at least. She's always been pretty incredible and remained pretty solidly in the A tier. Her worst state I would say was in 2021 when she got a number of her strong add-ons nerfed, and still had 5 hatchets back then. She lost strong combos such as having 3 eerie head hatchets with infantry belt and iridescent head, and her old exhaustion add-ons which applied 90 seconds of exhaustion. So her weakest was when she lost those I guess, and before her current buffs. Pyramid Head has always been very good over the years, never having a weak state really, just some problems every now and then. His worst state was one he was in for a while, post his initial nerfs on launch, when his ranged attack was given a longer cancel animation, and he could no longer camp cages, up until the very recent 2025 PTB, where he got an add-on overhaul. This time between was his weakest I would say, and this was hardly weak, let's be honest. It was also a span of like 4 years, so yeah, to put it into perspective, I feel like he's never been weak, basically. Dracula, there's not really much to comment on at all. His weakest state is probably just his current state, post some very minor nerfs from 2024. He's been strong since release and now to the current day. Kaneki has been nerfed quite a lot since his incredibly powerful launch, but he's still really busted. Despite all that's happened to him, he's remained incredible and doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon, despite this being his weakest state, I guess. Nurse, of course, is our number one. While she's also had nerfs basically solely since her release back in 2016, she's remained insane throughout it all. Even her really bad states have been incredibly powerful still. Therefore, Nurse is still number one even through this. Her weakest, if I had to maybe take a guess, would be somewhere in her early days when she wasn't able to blink between floors and Lightburn was still a thing. Somewhere around there. Alright, well, that's gonna do it. Let me know your thoughts as always down below. Thanks, and goodbye.